They wanted a villain the moment I stopped letting them get away with everything. The moment I raised my voice, the narrative changed. Suddenly I was aggressive, ungrateful, cold. They didn't mention the months I stayed quiet, the countless times I forgave in silence, the way I swallowed disrespect just to keep the peace. No, none of that mattered. Because the second I refused to shrink, I became a threat. Not for what I did, but for what I stopped doing. I stopped explaining. I stopped justifying. I stopped making them feel comfortable while they tore pieces off of me. That's when the mask slipped. That's when they pointed the finger. They needed someone to blame for their own inability to face themselves. So they made me the villain. They rewrote history. They erased their actions and highlighted my reaction. They ignored the pattern, isolated the moment, and told the world I snapped. But I didn't snap. I evolved. I learned. And when you finally start to protect your peace, people who used to feed off your chaos don't like the change. They preferred the version of me who stayed quiet, forgave too easily, and made excuses for their behavior. They missed the version who never fought back. But that version is buried now. That version died from self-betrayal. They called it changing. I call it waking up. I got tired of being gaslit, of being told my emotions were too much, while theirs burned the whole room. Tired of giving all my energy just to be made into the enemy when I had nothing left to give. And so, I stopped. I stopped making them the center of my life. I stopped bleeding for people who wouldn't even hand me a bandage. That silence, that distance, that's not rage. That's survival. That's me refusing to die in a story I didn't write. They wanted a villain, so I stopped being the hero. I stopped saving them from their own reflection. I gave them what they asked for: distance, indifference, consequence. They called me a monster. But monsters are made, not born. So if that's what they wanted, then they should have prepared for what comes next. Because this time, I'm not coming back. I'm not apologizing. I'm not shrinking. Fine. You wanted a villain? Then watch what happens next. It started with trust. Blind, full-hearted trust. The kind you give when you truly believe someone wouldn't use your softness as leverage. You weren't playing a role. You weren't calculating. You showed up with love that didn't come with a price tag. You gave loyalty without second thought, patience without recognition, silence even when everything inside you screamed. You gave them the kind of grace most people aren't used to, and they took it, not cautiously, not respectfully, but like it was owed to them, like your kindness was currency they never had to earn. You tried to see the good in them, even when it was buried under patterns that should have been red flags. You let things slide. You stayed quiet in moments when you should have spoken. You forgave before apologies were even offered. Because you didn't love halfway. You weren't the type to keep score. You just kept showing up. But what you didn't realize then was that some people don't see loyalty as love. They see it as a weakness to be manipulated. They drained you slowly, methodically, piece by piece. Not just your energy, but your confidence, your voice, your clarity. Until one day you started second-guessing everything you did, even when your intentions were pure. That's the part they'll never mention. The slow unraveling. The nights you laid in bed replaying every conversation, wondering if you were too much, too intense, too sensitive. They won't talk about how they made you feel crazy for having standards, how they turned their neglect into your guilt. Because when they didn't want to be held accountable, they flipped the script. They called your honesty drama. Your boundaries were the suddenly attitude, and your hurt. That became a burden they claimed they couldn't carry. So you started shrinking. You smiled when you wanted to scream. You agreed just to keep things peaceful. You lowered your expectations to match their inconsistencies. And every time they pulled away, you blamed yourself for being too hard to love. That's what they do. They don't leave with honesty. They leave slowly, through silence, withdrawal, and manipulation. And then when you finally react, when you finally have enough, they call you unstable. That's the twist. They provoke the fire and then act surprised when it burns. Your emotional breakdown didn't come from weakness. It came from being pushed beyond your limits by people who expected you to stay kind while they tore you apart. They fed off your peace and still complained you weren't doing enough. They created the storm and then pointed fingers when you drowned in it. That's the hardest part to accept, that they knew. They weren't clueless. They just didn't care. They watched you carry the weight of two people and then blamed you when you collapsed. And when you finally stopped trying, when your silence became louder than your words, they branded you as cold. But you weren't born cold. You were pushed there. Pushed by broken promises, ghosted conversations, and the endless cycle of giving without receiving. You didn't wake up one day detached. You had to rip yourself out of a version of love that only loved you when you were easy to control. That detachment didn't come from a place of ego. It came from survival. You stopped pouring into people who only showed up with empty hands. And suddenly, you were the problem. That's how it works. They break the hero and fear the result. They want you to keep bleeding gracefully, to keep loving them even when they're absent. The moment you stop, that's when they start calling you names. Monster, toxic, difficult, cold. Because they're not used to boundaries. They're not used to people standing up and saying, no more. You flipped the script, not to hurt them, but to save yourself. You built walls because the door was never respected. You set limits because your limitless love was taken advantage of. They never tell the full story, just their version, the one where you're the villain and they're the victim. But behind every so-called outburst was 100 silent sacrifices. Behind every boundary was 100 moments of betrayal. They don't talk about that. They just call you different now. And you are different. You had to be, because the version of you who tolerated the disrespect was dying slowly, and you chose to resurrect yourself instead. You gave everything, loyalty that never wavered, patience that cost you sleep, love that asked for nothing back, and all it earned you was a reputation built on misunderstanding. But that's what happens when you stop dancing to the tune of their comfort. They call it rebellion. They call it selfish. But it's not. It's self-respect. It's finally choosing to put the same energy into yourself that you were so willing to give to someone else. They didn't just lose you. They lost the one person who would have never given up on them. And now they're scared of what that version of you has become. There's a moment most people never see coming. It doesn't start with rage or even sadness. It begins with silence, a certain kind of quiet that settles inside your chest after one too many unanswered questions, one too many nights laying awake, trying to figure out how someone could claim to care about you while slowly watching you fall apart, doing absolutely nothing to stop it. That silence builds. It wraps around your heart like armor. Not all at once, but gradually, word by word, moment by moment, lie by lie. You don't feel it until it's already in place. Until one day you realize you're not hoping anymore. You're watching, calculating, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. That's when it changes, when the shift begins, when you go from being the one who overthinks to the one who observes without emotion. It isn't because you stopped caring. You just stopped caring in the way that left you exposed, because after enough betrayal, something inside you changes permanently. You stop needing closure. You stop needing explanations. You stop needing them to make sense. You recognize the pattern, and you finally choose to protect your peace over their potential. Gaslighting doesn't feel like abuse at first. It feels like confusion. It feels like maybe you're too sensitive. Maybe you read it wrong. Maybe it really is your fault. You question your own reactions, your own instincts, your own gut. And that's the most dangerous part, when someone convinces you that what you're feeling isn't real, when they call your truth an overreaction, when they respond to your pain with silence or blame. That's not love, that's control. And control dressed as care can kill parts of you that used to be soft. So you start adapting, not to win them back, but to never be that vulnerable again. You learn to mask your emotions. You smile while you bleed. You carry your pain without showing a limp. You pretend you're okay just enough to avoid another round of being called dramatic. And the people around you, they don't see what's happening, because transformation doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes the loudest shift is the one that doesn't need to be spoken. You don't even tell them you're done. You just stop showing up emotionally. You stop defending yourself. You stop chasing the apology. And that terrifies them more than any outburst ever could. The exact moment it changed. It wasn't a big fight. It wasn't a scream. It was a look. A glance across a room where you realized they weren't sorry. They weren't even conflicted. They were comfortable. Comfortable with your pain. Comfortable with what they were doing to you. That look said, I know what I'm doing, and I'll keep doing it, because you'll stay. And that's when something broke. Not loudly, but permanently. The loyalty snapped. The compassion froze. And everything you were holding on to started to fall apart in silence. You realized then that love, in the wrong hands, becomes a weapon. When people know you'll forgive them over and over again, they stop being careful with your heart. They start seeing it as indestructible. They stop treating it like something that bleeds. They become reckless because they know you'll pick up the pieces. And when you finally stop, they call you heartless. They call you bitter. But they don't call themselves accountable, because it was never about mutual care. It was about power. And the second you stop playing their game, you take it back. From that moment forward, you don't run on hope anymore. You run on logic. You trade your emotions for blueprints. You get strategic with your energy. You learn when to speak and when to say nothing. You study your surroundings. You watch people more than you speak to them. You calculate your moves, not to hurt anyone, but to protect what's left. Because survival doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like disappearing from the lives of people who never really saw you. Your conversations get shorter. Your expectations drop to zero, not because you hate people, but because you've learned not to expect fire from wet matches. The mask they once wore begins to fade. You start seeing them clearly for the first time, and what you see, it doesn't deserve the love you gave. It doesn't even deserve a reaction. They mistake your silence for weakness. But silence isn't surrender. It's strategy. It's the final decision, the closing door, the invisible line they'll never cross again. You didn't go cold. You went focused. Your warmth is now reserved for people who know what to do with it. Your time is now currency you don't hand out freely. You stop explaining your absence. You stop justifying your standards. You stop breaking yourself into pieces to make others feel whole. You're not the villain in this story. You're the one who survived being cast as the villain for finally saying no, for finally choosing self-respect over self-sacrifice. They don't talk about the betrayal. They talk about your reaction to it. They don't talk about the countless times you stayed silent out of love. They talk about the moment you snapped, because that's what cowards do. They provoke your fire and then scream when it burns. They create the storm and blame you for the lightning. But you're done. You're done trying to fix stories you didn't write. You're done trying to be soft in a world that only loved you when you were silent. This is the moment they remember forever. Not the time you cried, not the time you begged, but the moment your silence became lethal. The moment your gaze said, "You'll never have access again." That's the switch. That's when the loyal heart becomes the quiet threat. And that's when they start to fear the very thing they created. Because you didn't become dangerous by choice. You became dangerous by survival. You went from hoping to calculating, from patience to precision. And once that change happens, there's no turning back. The storm they tried to control now has its own mind, and it's not looking for revenge, it's looking for results. The transformation didn't start with a new haircut, a motivational playlist, or some grand announcement. It started quietly. It started the morning you woke up and didn't reach for your phone to check if they had messaged. It started when you walked past the mirror and didn't see a person begging for validation staring back. You didn't become untouchable overnight. You built it in layers, quietly, carefully, out of survival, out of necessity. The old version of you, the one that let things slide, that forgave too easily, that explained yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, was slowly disappearing. You didn't even mourn it. You just watched it fade, and you let it go, because that version of you was designed to survive. This new one? This one was built to rule. You started with your body. Not because you were vain, but because it was the one thing you could control when everything else felt like chaos. You remembered the nights your body carried the weight of your sadness, the way it trembled under anxiety, how you sat slumped in silence, numb. You owed it more than that, so you got up, even when it hurt, even when you had no motivation, even when you cried through the reps. You showed up for your body the way no one else showed up for your heart. The gym wasn't therapy, but it became a war zone, and you trained like you were preparing for something no one could see. Because you were. You weren't sculpting abs. You were rebuilding armor. You changed your routines. You stopped sleeping through your pain. You stopped numbing yourself with distractions. You got disciplined, brutal with your time, protective of your focus. People thought you were isolating, but they didn't know what you were doing in the silence. You weren't hiding, you were sharpening. Every ignored call was time spent mastering your craft. Every Friday night you stayed in was a page written, a muscle built, a habit formed. You weren't healing for aesthetics. You were engineering a version of yourself they couldn't even imagine. Your mind was next. You used to let people live in your head rent-free. You replayed old conversations. You obsessed over why they left, why they lied, why they changed. That noise used to keep you up at night, so you silenced it. Not with revenge fantasies, but with purpose. You stopped chasing answers. You started chasing goals. You fed your mind with knowledge, books, podcasts, strategy. You learned to sit with your discomfort instead of running from it. The same silence that once haunted you became your meditation. The pain that used to control you became your motivation. The anxiety that paralyzed you became your fuel. You didn't just survive the darkness, you turned it into your classroom. Then came the soul. That was the hardest part, because rebuilding your soul meant forgiving yourself first, not them, you, for staying too long, for shrinking, for betraying your instincts, for choosing their comfort over your peace. You stopped looking outward and started holding yourself accountable. You admitted where you ignored the signs, where you confused chaos with passion, where you romanticized toxicity and called it connection. That honesty cut deep, but it also set you free. You weren't broken. You were just buried under other people's projections. The moment you realized that was the moment you stepped into your power. Real power doesn't scream. It whispers, "I know who I am now." And you did. Finally, people around you started noticing the change. You spoke less, but when you did, your words hit harder. You stopped explaining yourself. You stopped justifying your distance. You stopped attending every argument you were invited to. They thought you went cold. What they didn't know is that you went calculated. You were no longer moved by the same tactics, no longer fooled by pretty words with empty actions. You saw through manipulation with ease. You weren't angry, you were just done. You cleaned your space, you cleaned your contact list, you cleaned your habits, you deleted conversations that went nowhere, you archived pictures that reminded you of fake memories. You let go of people who didn't clap when you were rebuilding. You became ruthless with your energy, not because you were cruel, but because you learned how expensive your peace really was. You stopped offering discounts. That's what scared them the most. Not that you changed, but that you no longer needed them to. And with that came the rebirth. Cold, merciless, focused. The old you would have waited, would have hoped, would have sent one more message. This version of you. He lets phones ring unanswered. He walks away mid-conversation if respect is missing. He doesn't raise his voice. He raises his standards. You didn't become bitter. You became clear. The kind of clear that intimidates anyone who once fed off your confusion. You stopped being the person who gave endless second chances. The one who over-explained, over-cared, overcompensated. You stopped being soft for people who mistook softness for stupidity. You didn't lose your heart. You learned to guard it. You didn't lose your soul. You learned who was worth sharing it with. You didn't stop feeling. You just stopped bleeding for people who never offered a bandage. That's transformation. Not loud, not posted online, not for public consumption. Quiet, internal, permanent. Now when people from the past reach out, they're not met with anger. They're met with silence, or worse, indifference. You don't even need to block them. You've evolved so far past the version they knew that you're unrecognizable. They don't know how to talk to the new you, the one who doesn't entertain small talk, the one who doesn't pretend to forget, the one who smiles, says nothing, and keeps building. That's the true power, when they no longer have the language to access you. They wanted war, so you trained in silence, and now there's nothing left to prove. No vengeance to chase, no need to explain why you walked away. The transformation speaks for itself. It's in how you carry yourself, how you don't flinch when old triggers try to resurface, how you don't respond to the same games, how you outgrew everything they thought would keep you small. You're not the villain, you're the aftermath, the consequence. The final chapter they never saw coming, and by the time they realize it, you'll be so far ahead, they won't even be able to catch a glimpse. The old you died in the fire. The new you walks through it, untouched, unshaken, untouchable. You didn't become the monster the moment they expected you to. They were looking for anger, waiting for an explosion, some public display they could point at and say, "See? I told you they were the problem." But that moment never came. What came instead was colder, quieter, more effective. It wasn't a rage-fueled spiral or a screaming match. It was a decision, a slow, surgical removal of your emotions from their grip. You didn't become cruel. You became calculated. You didn't snap. You studied. They thought you were going to fall apart, but you started pulling yourself together in a way they never saw coming. It's not that you stopped caring all at once. You just stopped offering it to people who treated it like it was disposable. The switch didn't flip overnight. It was gradual, a process made up of moments they'll never remember, but you'll never forget. The night you stared at your phone for hours and never got a reply. The time you explained your feelings with trembling honesty, only to be met with silence. The 100 little ways they taught you that your heart was too soft for their games. And after enough damage, something inside you just stopped bleeding, not because the wounds weren't there, but because you finally learned how to stop reopening them. You didn't go numb. You went aware of how much energy you were wasting trying to fix what they were actively breaking, aware of how often you were the only one trying, aware of how their comfort was being funded by your pain. That awareness built walls, not to keep everyone out, but to finally keep yourself in, because the person you kept abandoning to accommodate them deserved better. You deserved better. And that realization didn't make you bitter. It made you clear. People confuse detachment with indifference. It's not the same. You still feel everything. You just don't show it to everyone anymore. You protect your peace with precision now. You don't react when disrespected. You remove access. You don't beg for understanding. You withdraw. That's what unnerves them, because people who rely on your emotional reactions to feel powerful don't know what to do when all you give them is silence. They poke and prod and provoke, hoping for the old version of you to resurface, the one who would have fought, cried, pleaded. But that version is gone. You buried it when you realized how much it cost you to keep it alive. They started calling you cold. But cold isn't evil. Cold is calm. Cold is controlled. Cold is what happens when you finally learn the rules. You see how the game works now. You see how people create chaos, then act confused when you refuse to play. You see how they demand grace they never give, how they disappear when you're hurting, then return when it's convenient. You don't engage with that anymore. You've built something stronger than affection. You've built boundaries. You've built standards so high they can't reach you with charm alone. They can't talk their way back in. Not this time. You're not malicious. You're methodical. You're not angry. You're aligned. Your presence no longer means automatic forgiveness. Your time isn't free. Your silence isn't passive. It's a verdict. And when you walk away now, there are no dramatic exits, no final messages, no closure. You just leave. And you leave absolutely. That's what being the monster means. Not rage, not cruelty, but ruthless self-respect. It means choosing yourself with a level of clarity so sharp it feels threatening to those who are used to your confusion. They tell people you changed, and they're right. You did. You changed from someone who tolerated the bare minimum into someone who doesn't flinch when people walk away. You changed from someone who tried to fix everything into someone who lets it break if it wasn't built right. You changed from emotionally available to emotionally expensive. Now you don't react. You observe. You don't chase. You decide. That control? You earned it through every heartbreak, through every manipulation you saw through too late, through every fake apology that made you feel guilty for demanding more. The monster they fear isn't violent. He's intentional. He speaks less, moves smarter, loves slower, trusts harder, and when he's done in a way that's irreversible. You don't block out of spite. You block because access is earned, not owed. You don't reply out of guilt. You stay silent because your peace is not a negotiation. And the people who once called you too much are now craving just a fraction of your energy. They don't know how to ask for it anymore because they know they wouldn't survive your indifference. What scares them most isn't your success, your new body, your glow up. It's the fact that you're no longer waiting to be seen, that you no longer flinch at the sound of their name, that their opinion doesn't shape your choices anymore. You've become untouchable, not because you built a new life, but because you built a new standard, one that refuses to let the same pain in twice. You are no longer interested in proving your worth to people who watched you fall and never reached out. You no longer try to explain what they did to you. You let their own silence convict them. You let their actions speak louder than any confrontation. That's the most terrifying thing about who you've become. You don't need revenge. You don't need apologies. You don't even need closure. You only need distance, and once it's given, you never return. They call you a monster because you don't love the way they remember. Because now your love comes with requirements. Because now your presence feels earned, not expected. Because now you protect what they used to take for granted. And when they finally realize that they created the version of you they can no longer reach, it won't be hate that eats them alive. It'll be regret. Quiet, heavy, inescapable regret. The monster isn't the villain. The monster is the byproduct of betrayal, of emotional starvation, of surviving 1,000 cuts while everyone looked the other way. And when they ask what happened to you, don't answer. Let them sit with the silence. Let them sit with the loss. Let them figure out how someone they used to control became the one they can't even understand anymore. You didn't become the monster. You just stopped pretending to be the hero for people who kept creating villains out of your boundaries. They didn't just walk away. They rewrote the story on their way out. You gave them your time, your patience, your heart, and they gave you a role you never auditioned for. The villain. You were cast as the problem, painted as the one who snapped, the one who changed, the one who turned cold. They never mentioned the months you stayed calm while drowning. They didn't tell anyone how many times you bit your tongue while their words cut you open. All they gave the world was the edited version, the one where you're cold, reactive, bitter. And the worst part is, people believed it because they spoke first. And that's how stories get shaped into the real world, by the one who tells it loudest, not the one who lived it most truthfully. They made sure to speak before you could gather yourself, before you could even process what had happened. While you were still bleeding in silence, they were out there describing your wounds as self-inflicted. They played the victim with precision, with charm. They twisted your reactions into evidence. Your boundaries became mood swings. Your distance became pettiness. And your silence? They called it guilt. You kept quiet, not because you didn't have anything to say, but because you still had dignity. You weren't going to beg people to understand your side. You weren't going to play defense in a war you didn't start. You weren't going to turn your pain into public performance. But in doing that, you lost control of the narrative. And they took full advantage. They turned mutual friends into allies. They turned your hesitations into proof. They took your breakdowns and turned them into warnings. Be careful with them, they whispered. They're unstable. They're not who they seem. No one asked what pushed you to that point. No one wondered why the most patient person they knew suddenly stopped answering messages. Why the person who always showed up stopped showing up. Because it's easier to believe you changed than to ask what changed you. It's easier to paint you as unpredictable than to admit they were slowly poisoning your peace. They didn't show people the days they ignored your calls, the manipulation dressed as care, the cold withdrawal every time you needed warmth. They didn't explain how they slowly stopped treating you like a person and more like a convenience. How they disappeared when you were at your lowest, only to return when they needed something from you. They didn't talk about how they ghosted you, then blamed you for the silence. How they made you feel invisible and then mocked you when you stopped trying to be seen. They didn't say how you kept giving, hoping, trying, long after they stopped deserving it. They left all of that out. Instead, they performed. They told half-truths with full conviction. They knew how to sound broken without ever admitting guilt. They wore your pain like a costume and collected sympathy from people who didn't know better. And the people listening, most didn't know the history. They didn't see the private messages, the long nights, the missed birthdays, the disrespect masked as sarcasm. They just saw the version of you that finally cracked, and they called it crazy. But you weren't crazy. You were exhausted. Exhausted from holding a story no one believed, from staying silent while your character was assassinated in every room you weren't in, from watching people you once called friends repost things about toxic energy, not realizing they were talking about you. That's the kind of betrayal that cuts the deepest. Not the breakup, not the silence, but the lies. The story being told with your name in it, rewritten without your consent. And yet, you still didn't fight back. You let them talk. You let them lie. You let them shape their version of reality. Because you knew something they didn't. You knew the truth would survive longer than the noise. You knew that the people who mattered would eventually see what was real. And most of all, you knew that you didn't need to defend a story you no longer lived in. You walked away, not because you were weak, but because you were finally strong enough to stop bleeding for people who only knew how to cut. Now, they talk about you in confusion. They still bring your name up, not out of concern, but out of curiosity. They can't understand how you moved on without announcing it, how you built something stable while they're still stuck in circles. They're still telling the same story while you're living a new chapter. And that's silence. That's your revenge. The absence of your voice where it used to echo in their life. The peace you found in a world that once tried to make you the villain. They told the world you were cold, but they didn't say how long they froze you first. They didn't mention how many winters you survived waiting for their warmth. They don't tell people how many times you stood at the door waiting for them to show up, while they told others you slammed it shut. They won't talk about the good you did, only the moment you stopped doing it, because people remember the fall, not the push. They remember the silence, not what caused it. So you let them talk, let them tell their version, because one day, those same people who believed them will see the truth in your peace. They'll notice the consistency in your absence. They'll feel the weight of the silence you left behind. And when that happens, they'll ask the same question everyone eventually does. What really happened? And by then, it won't matter, because you'll be too far ahead to explain, too focused to look back, too evolved to care about proving who you were to people committed to misunderstanding you. You'll walk with calm in your chest and fire in your purpose. And that story, the one they tried to bury you in, it'll turn into the foundation for everything you're building now. Not as a villain, but as the one who finally stopped apologizing for refusing to be broken again. It doesn't start with blocking them. It starts with not caring whether they reach out. It starts when their name pops up in your memory and there's no emotion tied to it, just stillness. You don't hate them. You don't miss them. You don't feel anything. And that's when you realize the real erasure has begun. Not from your phone, from your heart, from your nervous system, from the parts of you that once clenched at the sound of their voice. The damage they caused used to live in your bones. Now it's just dust, swept out quietly in the stillness they used to fear. You used to hold on to pieces of them, messages you couldn't delete, photos you couldn't look at but couldn't throw away either. You'd scroll, then stop yourself. You'd reread things, replay words, try to find meaning in the chaos. You weren't looking for nostalgia. You were looking for evidence that what you felt was real, that it wasn't all in your head, that at some point they meant it. But that's the thing about erasure. It begins when you stop needing the proof. You stop explaining what happened, even to yourself. You stop rewriting the story. You stop giving them the power of memory. The people around you don't even notice it at first. They think you're doing better because you've stopped bringing them up. They think it's growth. It is, but not the kind that comes from healing through love. This is different. This is surgical. This is the kind of healing that happens after you give up on the apology, after you accept that closure won't arrive. You didn't get peace. You created distance. And through that distance, something inside you closed for good. Not in anger, but in clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't require conversations. It just knows. And when something in you knows, it erases. You no longer flinch when you hear their name. You don't check who watched your stories. You don't care what they're doing or who they're doing it with. You don't compare. You don't hope. And most terrifying for them, you don't look back. They don't realize how bad it is until they test it. They send the message. They make the call. They check in. Just wanted to see how you're doing. And for the first time, it doesn't pull you into anything. You don't get that stomach drop. You don't rehearse a reply. You don't reply at all, because access was the last thread. And now that it's cut, there's nothing left to salvage. You erased them, not to get even, but to get clean. You don't need revenge. You needed release. They thought they were irreplaceable, but erasure isn't about replacement. It's about absence. Not filling the gap, but sealing it. And when you do that, it confuses them more than anger ever could. They expected an explosion. What they got was a void, one they can't yell into, one that echoes back their own silence. They don't realize how loud silence is until it answers them, when they start noticing the coldness in the air they used to warm with your presence, when they see their texts go unread, when they realize you've stopped caring enough to even be upset. That's the death of sentimentality. You buried the hope. You buried the softness. You buried the idea that they'd come back and make it right. You're not waiting anymore. You're not even watching. You're gone. Not physically, emotionally, energetically, spiritually. Gone in a way they can't reach. Not through guilt, not through charm, not even through apology. The hardest part about erasing someone is that it happens after you begged for connection, after you tried, after you fought for it longer than you should have. People think letting go is sudden. It's not. It's the end result of 1,000 internal arguments. 1,000 times you gave them grace they never earned. 1,000 moments you chose silence over truth just to keep them comfortable. Erasure isn't the start. It's the end. The last card. The final wall built from every red flag you ignored. You stopped asking why. That's when it began. You stopped needing to understand, because understanding them was always about trying to justify why they hurt you. But some people hurt you simply because they can, because they think you'll stay, because they don't think you'll ever get tired. But you did, and now you're quiet. Now you're focused. Now you're building a version of yourself they'll never get to know. They lost you in stages, but the last stage was erasure, and that one doesn't get undone. There's no drama in this part. No slammed doors, no angry voice notes. Just silence. Just absence. Just a life moving forward without a single trace of them left in it. You deleted the photos without blinking. You stopped mentioning them in stories. You no longer attach their name to your pain. That chapter, it's not just closed. It's removed, not hidden, not archived, gone. The story still exists, but their character got cut from the final version. You don't even remember the exact moment it happened, because erasure doesn't come with fireworks. It arrives like peace, slow, heavy, permanent. They say time heals, but time did nothing. You did. You healed because you stopped trying to prove something to someone who was never listening. You stopped showing up for someone who kept leaving. You stopped giving updates to someone who already made up their mind. That's what real erasure looks like. It's not mean. It's not cruel. It's the cleanest thing you've ever done. You stopped giving CPR to something that died in their hands, not yours. And now if they ever come back, they'll be talking to a ghost, to someone who remembers everything but no longer feels anything. And that's what hits hardest. That they had someone real, someone loyal, someone who would have gone to war for them. And now they have an empty space where that person used to be. They called your silence a game. They called your distance a phase. Until they realized it wasn't temporary. It was final. You don't hurt them by screaming. You hurt them by forgetting, not pretending. Actually forgetting. Not because it didn't matter, but because you mattered more. You erased them when you realized your peace required subtraction. And the moment you stopped letting the past have a seat at your table, you stepped into a future they won't be a part of. They don't see it yet, but one day they'll feel it. In the silence, in the stillness, in the place where your warmth used to be. And when they do, it'll be too late, because the version of you that once waited is never coming back, and the version they created erased them without hesitation. They always thought your silence meant defeat, that stepping back meant you'd given up. What they didn't realize was that while they were watching for drama, you were building in silence. They wanted a reaction, but you gave them distance. They wanted chaos, but you chose control. While they laughed, while they moved on fast, while they pretended nothing happened, you were still. You were in pain, sure, but not paralyzed. You were hurting, but every ounce of that pain was repurposed, quietly, methodically, strategically. They saw nothing, and that was the point. Because when you rise, it shouldn't be seen in process. It should be felt in presence. And now, you're not rising to prove anything. You're rising because they no longer have the power to keep you down. The monster they helped create didn't come to haunt them. It came to evolve. And that evolution didn't scream. It didn't throw tantrums. It didn't seek revenge in the way they expected. No, the rise was brutal in its silence. It happened in cold mornings where you woke up with no reason and still made your bed. It happened in sleepless nights where the memories punched your ribs, but you still showed up to your goals. It happened when you unfollowed their energy, not just online, but mentally, spiritually. They were a virus in your peace, and you chose healing over explanation. And now they feel your absence like hunger, like an itch they can't scratch. They scroll through your updates, not because they miss you, but because they can't understand how you've become untouchable. They used to know everything about you, your moods, your insecurities, your pain points. Now they know nothing. They watch the new version of you like spectators. But this time, they're not in the front row. They're not even allowed in the room. They stalk quietly. They monitor silently. They ask around subtly. You seen them lately? Not out of care, but confusion. Because the person you've become terrifies them. Not because you're mean, but because you're healed. And healed people don't play by the same rules. Healed people don't chase. They don't explain. They don't invite chaos back in just because it knocks politely. You built in pain. That's what they'll never understand. Your glow-up wasn't born in comfort. It was forged in grief, in anger, in loneliness. You were lifting weights with heartbreak still in your chest. You were waking up to a cold phone and still showing up to your grind. You were breaking inside and still building something unbreakable outside. That's the part they missed. They thought time would wear you down, but it carved you into something sharper, something they can't touch anymore. You no longer crave validation. You crave results. You no longer wish they'd apologize. You wish they try to come back, just so you can prove how far gone you are. They say success is the best revenge, but that's not true. Indifference is, because success can still be shared. Peace, though? True peace. It locks them out. It denies them entry. It makes them realize they never had any real power over you. They didn't break you. They just exposed what needed fixing. And now, you're fixed in a way that doesn't have a back door. They don't even get to witness the blueprint. All they get is the final product, a version of you so focused, so disciplined, so detached from the past, that even your shadow doesn't flinch in their presence. They called you a villain. That's what happens when people can't control you anymore. You say no, you stop replying, you pull back your energy, and suddenly you're cold, fake, selfish. But villains don't lose sleep. Villains aren't confused. Villains don't care about opinions. And that's what's hardest for them to accept, that they have no idea what keeps you up at night anymore, because it's not them, not their actions, not their words. They used to be the reason for your anxiety, your tears, your overthinking. Now they're just noise, and noise doesn't shake structure. You stopped reacting. That was the shift. You stopped defending yourself. You stopped clarifying the narrative. You stopped participating in their chaos. And that silence, that's what really broke them. They expected anger. They expected arguments. They expected some grand display of bitterness. But all you gave them was distance and growth. You grew past the point of needing to be understood by people who were committed to misunderstanding you. You grew into your power, not in loud statements, but in routines, in boundaries, in small wins that added up to an empire they can't touch. Now your rise is personal. It's not about proving them wrong. It's about proving to yourself that the version of you who stayed too long cared too much. gave too often. That version didn't die in vain. That pain had a purpose. That every setback, every betrayal, every night you felt like you weren't enough, it was all building something inside you, something they were never meant to see completed, because they don't deserve to know the ending of a story they tried to cut short. You walk differently now, not because of pride, but because of peace. You talk less. You observe more. You protect your space like it's sacred. Because it is. You've paid too high a price to let old energies creep back in. And they feel that. They feel the gate. They feel the new boundaries. They feel that whatever version of you they thought they had access to is long gone. And what stands in front of them now is a person who owes them nothing. Not words, not warmth, not entry. This is your power. Power beyond their reach. Because real power isn't in how loud you are. It's in how unfazed you've become. Real power is when they try to get a reaction and get stillness instead. When they speak on your name and you stay silent. Not because you're scared, but because you're done. Real power is when they realize they're not even part of the equation anymore. That your plans don't consider their existence. That their memories have no influence on your future. And every time they try to resurface, you don't block out of rage. You ignore out of choice. Because the cost of letting them back in is your peace. And that's not a currency you're willing to spend anymore. They can gossip. They can speculate. They can rewrite the past. But what they can't do is get close. Because you're no longer rising for attention. You're rising for legacy. And that's something they can never steal, fake, or replicate. They underestimated you. But worse, they overestimated their place in your life. And now they're just spectators watching a villain become untouchable. You thought I'd still be soft. Thought that because I didn't bark back the last time you crossed the line, I never would. You saw patience and assumed weakness. You saw silence and labeled it submission. But what you never understood is that people like me don't show their power in noise. We show it in what we let go, in what we walk away from without a word. And now, if you're wondering if I'm still that person, the answer is no. That version is gone. You're not looking at the forgiving heart anymore. You're standing in front of what your betrayal built. I don't play the same anymore. There are no warnings now, no emotional trial, no long talks about respect, loyalty, or intentions. One red flag, and I'm gone. One sign of ego games, and you won't get a follow-up. I used to give people chances out of love. Now I give them exits out of self-respect. The rules have changed. If you think you can test boundaries and still be welcomed back with open arms, you're not ready for this version of me. This version doesn't bleed for anyone who brings knives to the table. I used to over-explain, thinking maybe if you just understood me better, you'd change. I gave time to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. That was my fault. But I've learned. I've rewired the parts of me that gave without being asked and waited without being wanted. Now I match energy. If you're inconsistent, I go missing. If you bring confusion, I bring silence. And if you bring disrespect, I don't bring closure. I bring absence. People can only use what you offer. And I used to offer everything. Now I offer distance. To the next person who thinks they can play the same tricks. Don't. You won't find a soft landing here. I'm not here to be used as therapy for someone else's immaturity. I'm not here to absorb trauma and stay quiet because I care. I care about my peace now more than your comfort. I care about my boundaries more than your sob story. You had chances. You had the softer version of me. The one that gave grace too quickly and forgot too easily. That version would have defended you when people warned them. That version would have given you the benefit of the doubt even when you handed them lies. That version is buried now, and what stands here is sharper, colder, smarter. So here's your warning. If you come into my life now, know what you're walking into. This isn't the playground anymore. This is minefield territory. Respect is the minimum. Loyalty isn't negotiable. And consistency isn't a luxury, it's a requirement. I'm not asking for perfection, but I'm done entertaining chaos. I'm done fixing people who show up broken and use that as a weapon. If your idea of love involves control, manipulation, silence, or passive aggression, you're going to suffocate here. Because I don't play house with people who think affection is a performance and betrayal is an accident. You taught me how to go quiet. You taught me how to walk away without looking back. You taught me that no matter how loyal you are, some people will never see your value until you stop offering it. And when you stop, the game changes. The control is gone. The power shifts. And now, you're on the outside, watching a version of me that doesn't break, bend, or beg. You can't reach me anymore. Not through guilt, not through nostalgia, not through late-night apologies. I built a life where you don't fit, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because every time I think about what I lost, I realize it was never real. It was comfort, illusion, a version of love that required me to shrink to be accepted. That wasn't love. That was control, and I'm done being controlled. You don't get to call me bitter. You don't get to say I changed. You broke the mold, and now you're mad. The shape isn't the same. This is what happens when people play games with someone who was all heart. Eventually, the heart stops giving. Eventually, the tears dry. Eventually, the soul says, no more. And that's the moment you lost. Not when I blocked you. Not when I stopped talking. But when I stopped caring. When your name stopped meaning something. When your opinion no longer held weight. When your apology, if it ever comes, will land in silence. They say you become who you needed when you were hurting. Maybe that's true. Because now I've become the very thing I used to fear. Not bitter, just built. Not heartless, just healed. And it didn't come easy. It came through nights I didn't think I'd survive, through breakdowns no one saw, through rebuilding when there was nothing left. But I did it, alone. And now you're not just locked out, you're erased. And not even your guilt can get you back in. You see, they wanted a villain, and I gave them grace instead, over and over, until I couldn't anymore, until I realized grace without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. So I stopped being nice. I stopped being easy. I stopped explaining pain to people who caused it. And when they looked confused, when they said I changed, I smiled, because they were right. I changed into someone they'll never recognize again. They wanted a villain, and now they pray they never meet the monster again.